Grace United Church in Wellsville, New York. We're delighted that you're joining our worship service in this season of Lent. During this time, we are reflecting on passages that show us how to live our lives full to the brim. Today we'll reflect on a parable of Jesus that has such a message for us. I remember when I was growing up, my parents, they prayed for one of their friends in their family. You see, their friend's son had run away from home, and the couple hadn't heard from him in weeks. And then the weeks turned into months. The family struggled with the pain of not knowing, of worrying every day, of waiting for a phone call that never came. This must have been very, very difficult for them. Our scripture reading for today is a parable that Jesus told of another family whose son left home. It's actually the story of two sons and their relationship with their father. This is the third of three parables that Jesus told to a group of tax collectors and sinners mixed in with Pharisees and scribes. Though it's a story that most of us have heard before, there are some nuances that we may not have caught over the years. Now, when Jesus told the story, there were points and details that his hearers, they would have immediately understood. They would have immediately grasped. There are story gaps that they would have filled in just because of their background, of when they lived, and the context of their situation. How about we dig into this story a bit and examine it in light of some of the cultural surroundings and understandings that may escape us in our time? Perhaps we'll fill in some pieces that we might have missed along the way. The story starts like this. There was a man who had two sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me." The younger son wanted to strike out on his own, and so he asked for all of his inheritance from his father. To our ears, we hear such a request as the attempt by his son to get today what might be coming to him someday in the distant future. In our day, we find that request a little bit concerning because this kind of request could jeopardize a person's future. If we give away all of our savings, we may not have enough for what we need when we need to provide our own care and medicine as we age. These issues are some of the relevance to this story, but there's more to the story. In truth, the son is not actually asking for his inheritance, especially in that time of culture. An inheritance is what one receives when the father passes away, and it means that the son was then responsible to handle the father's duties. The son would become the leader and would assume the care and the power over what was left to him. So if your father owned a large farm with lots of servants and employees, then the responsibility of all of that was turned over to the son. Now the son could turn around and close shop and cash it all in, but that rarely happened. To that culture, the land, the business, and the family, they were all tied to the place that they were established. The idea would be that the sons took over to continue and to enlarge upon what was already established. And so this ask was a big deal. The father would have to portion off a third of his property to give it to his son. Now the oldest son would have received 2/3 of the property. But to cut off a third of his land would mean that the father would lose his standing in the community. To make it even worse, in asking for his inheritance, the son was basically saying that his father was of no use to him. He would rather have him dead. Now, scholars of ancient cultures, they say that to ask for the inheritance while the father is still alive is absolutely insulting. He's saying, "I want your stuff, but not you. My relationship with you is a means to an end." This kind of request was unheard of. But what's even more unheard of was the father's response, what the father did. A traditional Middle Eastern father could only respond in one way. This request would be met with refusal, anger, and punishment. He would be expected to drive a son out of the house with verbal, if not physical, blows. But this father, he responded differently. Jesus continues the story. So he divided his property between them. He gave him a third of his land. In portraying the Father this way, Jesus begins to paint a new picture of the character of God. Do you see what he's doing here? This would definitely not be the response that his hearers would have anticipated. He's enduring the worst thing imaginable, rejected love. In that situation, most of us would get mad, but he endures this rejection. The story continues. A few days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. He probably very quickly sold off all of the property that he received for whatever price that he could get. He wanted to go and live the way that he wanted to live. He wanted to do what he wanted to do, whatever struck him. He followed his own desires. But in time, this approach caught up with him. The story continues. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. This was a low spot for him. He did what he could to survive. And so he went and he hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would have gladly filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. He would have gladly eaten the pods. These were probably carob pods, pods that were fed to horses and cattle and pigs. These certainly weren't delicacies. He was eating what animals ate, and nobody cared enough about him to give him anything. Perhaps this situation began to jar his memory of the generosity of his father. Perhaps he reflected on how he had treated his father and how his father had responded to him. This misery helped him recognize who he was and what he had done. He recognized just how low he had gone. The story continues. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough to spare? But here I am, dying of hunger." And so there he is, and he's thinking about how the workers underneath his father, they all have more to eat than he does. He begins to develop a plan of how he could return. Perhaps he could make restitution. He knows that he couldn't be a son, but perhaps he could be an apprentice and learn a trade and maybe possibly pay his father back. In his departure, he may have even experienced a ceremony called the kazaza, which means literally the cutting off. The community would have thrown down an earthen pot, breaking it. It signifies that the Jewish boy is dead to them unless he bring an inheritance back. Once performed, he would be an outcast and no one would have anything else to do with him. One of the Dead Sea Scrolls gives this example of a fatherly warning that relates. "And now, my sons, be watchful of your inheritance that has been bequeathed to you, which your fathers gave to you. Do not give your inheritance to the Gentiles, lest you be humiliated in their eyes and foolish, and they trample upon you, and they become your masters." Well, this son, he decides that he needs to strategize. And so he even practices a little speech of what he will say, about how he will enact this plan of his that he's been thinking about. He says to himself, "I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.'" So he set off and went to his father. And here's where it gets interesting. Here again, Jesus offers us an insight into the character of God. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. His father saw him and his heart was filled with compassion. And what did he do? He ran. Now, in ancient times, a master of an estate wouldn't run. Children would run. Youths would run. Women would run, but not a master. This would be humiliating. And even more humiliating, it would be to be overcome with emotion. And yet, this father runs to him and kisses him. He acts like a mother, showing emotional abandon. He runs to him. He kisses him before the son can even speak one word. He kissed him. He forgave him. He welcomed him. And then the son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." Now the father heard him, but basically ignored him and immediately asked that a robe be brought. The scripture continues, "But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet.' He throws a coat over him. This is before he's cleaned. He covers him. He doesn't care. He loves him. He wants to celebrate. He orders his slaves, 'And get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us all eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate." In effect, the father says, "You're not going to earn your way back. I'm bringing you back." He asks that a fatted calf be prepared. This is a big deal. At a time and place where meat wasn't eaten at every meal was a special thing, and a fatted calf would be saved for a big event, something like a celebration feast. Jesus continues the story, sharing how the elder brother responds. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, "Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he has got him back, safe and sound." The older brother hears what's transpiring, and he's furious. Here he's been faithful all these years. He has done everything right. Then he became angry, and he refused to go in. I've heard it said that anger is a secondhand emotion. It's preceded by pain. They say where there's anger, there's always pain underneath. Think of a time when you've been angry. What pain was underneath your anger? So this brother, he's hurt and he's angry. His father comes out with him to plead with him to join in the celebration. But this eldest son, he lets loose. "Look," he says, "for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, this one who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him." Like the younger son, this elder son, he's insulting the father. First, he publicly humiliates him by not showing up at this great feast that his father's throwing. Then he doesn't go to the father, but instead makes the father come out and plead with him. He's so mad that he doesn't even address his father with respect. He doesn't say, "Father." He says, "Look." He's thinking, "How dare you do this?" And then he goes on to talk about the cost. "You gave him a calf. And that's a delicacy. The most extravagant thing that you could do would be to kill this fatted calf." You know, he was thinking about how he didn't even get a goat. He was so angry. He felt that he should have some say in this. In other words, he was saying to his father, just like his younger brother did, "I have some rights over your things." Sometimes when we do the right thing and others don't, it can make us so angry. It seems like they should be punished. And sometimes we think we should be the ones to mete out this justice. Just this last week, I saw a great film. It's a British drama called Philomena. It's based on a true story. In the film, human retribution is woven throughout the plot. It's the story of a young Irish woman who was punished for her shameful act. As a teenager, she was sent to a convent after conceiving a child out of wedlock. Her son was sold then to adoptive American parents when he was just a toddler. And for 50 years, Philomena had carried his picture and worried and wondered about him. Where is her son? Is he safe? Is he homeless? Does he know that he's loved? Whenever she visited the convent to inquire, the nuns wouldn't give her any information. When Philomena belatedly discovered that the convent had denied any information about her son, she confronted one of these sisters. She asked why they had kept the two apart. In the film, Sister Hildegard self-righteously proclaims how for all her life she had kept her vows of poverty and chastity and obedience. She had always done the right thing, and she felt that these girls got just what they deserved. These girls were rightfully punished for their shameful acts. She says that Philomena didn't deserve to know about her son. You see, Sister Hildegard was a little bit like this older brother in the story. She too was full of pain and anger. She had always done the right thing. And like this brother, she felt that those who didn't do the right thing should be punished. Now in the parable, the father responds to the elders' disrespect and arrogance in the same way as he did to the younger. I still want you in. Though other fathers would have rejected you for what you just did to me, publicly humiliating me and valuing my things over me, I still want you in. Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours, he responds. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and now has come to life. He was lost and has been found. How does this story end? What happens? Will the older brother accept the younger? Will they come together in love? We'll never know. But in this story, we learn some new things. You see, Jesus redefines God. Jesus is the first one to refer to God as a parent, but he defines what he means when he refers to God as a father. He redefines it. Jesus portrays a father unlike any of those at that time. His emotional abandon, his generosity, his ability to respond with love, to receive the agony of rejected love. God is all of these things. And Jesus showed the dimensionality of God's love, this meekness and majesty, the mercy and love, the suffering and longing for a relationship. Ultimately, the image of God that comes through is one of unconditional love, a God that embraces us, not because we're worthy, but because we're loved, a love that runs to greet us when we might be far from God. In the story, Jesus also teaches us about separation and loss. And in fact, Jesus redefines what we traditionally think of as sin. In the first part of the story, we see the traditional view of sin, a son who insults and hurts his father, caring more for his things than the father himself, the person who pilfers away relationships to do what he wants. He's selfish. We don't often think of this second son also being distant from the father. He too rejects and disregards the father. This older son wasn't distant from the father in spite of his goodness. He was distant because of what he considered to be his own goodness. He rejected his father because he thought he was justified, good, and right. He felt that he deserved things of the father. This certainly wasn't an ideal family situation. But isn't that the way it is? The ideal images of family are often wrecked by our own shortcomings. My parents' friends who had a son run away from home, they finally found out where their son was. They learned that he was in a distant state and that he was refusing to come back home. He was angry about some situations that had occurred, and as is always the case, the anger was covering over the pain and the hurt. The family finally got the news of this son's exact whereabouts, and the father flew to this distant city and they met together. Over waffles, they had a dinner, and the father and son talked. The father listened and listened. The son talked about his anger, his hurt, and his pain, and the father asked for forgiveness. He said that he had treated his son too harshly. He sought reconciliation with him. They talked for a long time, and finally the son decided to come back home. I recently heard about him, and he is reconciled with his family, and they've become in strong relationship with one another again. In this story, Jesus was addressing tax collectors and sinners, Pharisees and followers of the law. These represent two ways that people can seek their own ways. First, like the younger son looking for what is right for themselves. And second, like the elder son, to rely on moral conformity with the idea that if you do moral things, God owes you one. But both ways are really rejections of God, of a loving parent who cares and waits. But in the story, the father approaches all of those who are distanced, and lost with the same sense of unconditional grace. In a mysterious and miraculous way, God loves and forgives us even before we ask. God invites us to reconcile and to come in and celebrate even with people that we might consider unworthy. But this story awaits a response. I guess it is waiting for our response to an unexpected and undeserved love. Will we come to the party? Or are we too bad or too good to accept this invitation? In the film, Philomena, the now elderly Irish mother, begins a search for her long-lost son, separated from her by the nuns and adopted out to America. She's aided by a reporter who's telling her story. Philomena is haunted by dread that her son has felt his whole life that he was rejected and abandoned by her. She had wanted nothing to do with him. But in this film that's based on this true story, she encounters people that make her believe that her worst fears are true and that he didn't even think about her. And ultimately she finds that her son is now deceased, and she wonders if she'll ever know the truth. But in a remarkable turn of events, Philomena discovers that one of her late son's last wishes related to his resting place. To the frustration of his American family, his request was that his body be taken to Ireland and buried in the Abbey. It was the place where he had last seen his mother. His wish to do that gave her a deep acknowledgement that he had never forgotten her love for him. The film ends with her return home to find her son's grave not far from where she lived. We have a generous, gracious, loving, and forgiving God who has a wonderful party that he's inviting to, and is full to the brim. And so let us not think ourselves too bad or too good for the generosity that God is offering to us. We are all invited to join in this beautiful party that God is throwing for us.